Surface and runway safety is a significant challenge and a top priority for everyone in aviation. With a projected increase of operations across the national airspace system, and the risk of collision is always present when more than one aircraft is approaching, landing, departing, crossing, waiting on, or taxiing on the same runway. Our next panel, Surface Safety, will discuss this a little further. Please welcome NACA's National Runway Safety Representative, Bridget Sangratanakool, the ATO Western Service Area Runway Safety Team Manager, Emily Benuelos, the NACA's Surface Surveillance Representative, Dan Hamilton.
Good afternoon, guys. Today, we're going to be talking about surface safety, and I want to highlight something for you in particular that's really big in the NAS. It happens to be a continuous top 5. Previous to that, it was a top 5. It's wrong surface. So, what is our objective here today in the panel? Really what it is to bring more awareness to the field, that we are actually having these wrong surface events. So when I talk to you about wrong surface, what exactly am I talking to you about? I'm talking to you about aircraft that are landing at the wrong airport. And I did say that. They're landing at the wrong airport. We're also talking to you about aircraft that are landing on the wrong runway. So maybe you cleared them to land on the right, but then they end up landing on the left. I'm also talking to you about aircraft that are lining up and landing on a taxiway. And I did say that correctly. They are lining up and landing on a taxiway. Later on in the presentation, we'll look at some technology enhancements, and we'll actually talk to you about something that we're bringing forth to the controllers to help with that. The other elements here that I want to make sure that you guys know, because I don't think you necessarily do, is the frequency of this problem. So we are literally seeing a wrong surface event every other day. So Emily and I look at this data all the time. Every other day, I'm getting an email that has a wrong surface event on it. So that's why I need you guys to have that heightened sense of awareness in the field, because really, you are the last line of defense to help these pilots to go around. I'm going to talk to you first about some data. So we're going to look at some wrong surface arrival data, and then later on, we're going to talk about some wrong surface departure data. We'll go into managing risk. And then at the end, we're going to talk about some technology. But first off here, when we're looking at the wrong surface landing and approaches, we're looking at a little over 550 for the last 2.5 years. When Emily goes over the arrival, or the wrong surface departure, she's also going to talk about roughly another 500 incidents. So in the last 2.5 years, we have had over 1,000 incidents in the NAS where we have either lined up for, landed, or departed on the wrong surface. If you think about that in the overall comparison in the numbers of things that we do, it might be minute, but let's talk about risk in the NAS and what does that actually do. So first off, about 10% of the events that we have in the NAS are they're actually commercial aircraft, and about 90% of them are general aviation offenders. So with 90% being obviously a high frequency, and 10% being the commercial side, which is considerably lower, what does that actually mean? It actually means that we have a higher risk with the commercial aircraft, so that's why we need to emphasize that a little bit more. And that also puts you in a predicament whether you're working at a level 5 tower or you're working at a level 12 tower. It can happen to anybody out there, right? Another element that I'd like to bring up is that these events happen clear blue skies, okay? They're 90% of the time we're happening during the day. Another 90% of the time we're happening with 3 statute miles visibility or greater. So they're clear VFR days. So I mentioned a little bit before about where is this happening. So the highest frequency of locations is your level 9s and belows. About 90% of the time, that's where we're seeing the events take place. But that actually makes sense because you're looking at the highest frequency being general aviation aircraft. So you folks that work at the level 9s and belows, obviously you're you're more susceptible to those wrong surface events. Here's a slide just on the top 25 facilities that have wrong surface landings and approaches. This slide in particular isn't necessarily to pick out facilities by all means. What I'm trying to do is trying to show you here is that you are all susceptible. It doesn't matter if you're a Core 30 airport or if you're a level 5 tower. It can happen to you. So part of me talking about that is the fact that, quite honestly, it happened to me. I currently am a controller at DFW Tower. Previous to that, I worked at San Antonio, which is an up-down facility. It was a mid-operation, okay, so it was clear, blue skies. I had a lifeguard leader coming in from the east. She was pretty high and pretty fast, so I didn't like that approach in the first place. But let me talk to you about San Antonio for a second. We are landing to the southeast, and in that configuration, there's 2 parallel runways, one of which is 5,500 feet, the other one of which is about 8,500 feet. The 8,500 feet actually intersects with another runway that this lifeguard could turn right on and go to her parking location at the FBO. They're very closely spaced parallels, okay? And they're offset parallel runways. Keep that in mind when we talk about the contributing factors here in a minute. So I mentioned I'm working the mid. I'm gonna fast forward to when she's on final. You ever get that gut feeling when you're working and you just feel like something's wrong? Okay, that's kind of how I felt. So I stand up and I'm like, okay, it's in this tower, when you're looking at these closely spaced parallels, it's very difficult to determine whether or not they're lined up for the left runway or the right runway. And I bring that up because I know you're each there's many facilities out there that have very closely spaced parallels, and there are also many airports out there that have offset parallel runways. I didn't know that what I'm basically being set up for, the geometry of this airport, was a wrong runway alignment. Okay, so that lifeguard leader is now on about a mile final. I sent her around. I sent a lifeguard around. She comes back in, lands on the right side, and the very next day, I get a call from my ATM. The captain and the first officer came to my facility. They brought a really cute potted plant. It was Gerber daisies. I still have that pot, primarily because I'm cheap, probably, and the other thing is it's cute. But what I also kept was that card that they wrote. So what those lifeguard Lear pilots told me in the card was that I saved their life. They were lined up for the left runway. They were lined up for a 5,500-foot runway when they were planning for an 85-foot runway and to turn on the connecting runway to get to their FBO because they were a lifeguard and they were in a hurry. They had also previously asked me for a long landing. So when I was looking out the window, I could tell that it was a little bit off, but initially it was like, maybe they're just a little high because they wanted to land long. That wasn't the case. In that car, they told me I saved their lives. That's what I need from you guys. I need you guys to look into the system and realize the fact that, yes, this may not happen to me, but on the day that it does, what do I need from you? I need you to send them around, okay? Or make sure that they line up on the correct surface by all means, because they don't realize that they are lined up for the incorrect surface. They think that they are lined up for the correct one. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there in the first place. The next thing that I'd like to transition into here with Emily is wrong surface wrong surface departures. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay, thanks, Bridget. So like Bridget just told you about wrong surface arrivals, wrong surface departures are happening on average about 1 every other day. That number of 57 facilities experienced 3 or more events over this 2.5-year time period. We don't have 1 or 2 problem child airports. It's really a NAS-wide issue. And the numbers here are very similar to the wrong surface arrivals. We have 85% involving GA aircraft, a little bit more than that occurring at level 9 towers or below, and the majority of events, the vast majority, are in daytime VFR conditions. So those are the big numbers. Like Bridget pointed out though, For wrong surface departures, our number is a little bit higher. We've got almost 20% of events that involve a commercial aircraft, either as the aircraft that made the mistake or the aircraft that was affected by the mistake. And that's a very high number of lives at risk in each one of those events. Move the next slide. So again, this is a very similar distribution chart to what Bridget showed you for the wrong surface arrivals. We don't have really one category of airport that's sticking out here. We've got busy GA airports, flight training airports, and even some Core 30s on here. So the data that Bridget and I look at every day really raises the question, why are these surface events happening so often? Why are the wrong surface events happening so often? And what we find when we look into the data is it's not location specific, it's not even really operation specific. One thing people tend to think is that student pilots comprise a very large number of these events, and they really don't. They're not a disproportionate number of the events. Very experienced pilots are making the same mistakes as the very new pilots. So what we're finding is that these events are more dependent on certain risk factors being present in the operating environment. I'm going to have Bridget transition to contributing factors.
So we're going to talk about contributing factors here for a second, and I'll be honest, as you can already tell, I can talk quite a bit. But I'm only going to touch on a few topics here, and if you're more interested in this, please visit the surface safety booth. We have a bunch of contributing factors there that we can talk to you about, and it's obviously a topic that we're all very passionate about, and you should be as well. The first one I want to talk about here, the first element here that I want to talk to you about is where do we get these contributing factors? We actually pulled these from the 2017 and 2018 SRM panels. So we had all of industry together in one room, and these are the contributing factors that came up when we discussed those 1,000 events that we recently just saw. So first off, we have loss of situational awareness. I touched on this briefly before, but aircraft and pilots do not think they are lined up for the incorrect surface. Something is leading them in that direction. They believe that they are in the correct spot when they are landing on these surfaces. One thing I didn't mention before is that 20% of all the incidents we talked about are conflict events. So the aircraft that arrives to that wrong runway, or God forbid a taxiway or a wrong airport, 20% of the time, there's another aircraft that's occupying that surface. They are not alone out there, okay? So one of the leading factors that I kind of look at with regards to loss of situation awareness happens to be geometry. So can you kind of talk to us about what we've been seeing with regards to geometry and the contributing factors of it?
Yes, and this is one of the issues that came out of the Safety Collaboration Team SRM panel. It really, the wrong surface literature was pretty quiet on this point until that panel did their analysis. And what they found in looking at these wrong surface events is that parallel runways account for 75% of all of the wrong surface landings. So those parallel surfaces are the main factor involved. It can also involve a taxiway, a parallel taxiway. And even worse than just having parallel surfaces, when they are offset, when the thresholds are offset, that is a full 50% of wrong surface landings occur on offset parallel runways. So it's a huge driving factor in these events. The other 25% involve converging, crossing runways, or even wrong direction on the same pavement. So those are for arrivals. The wrong surface departures, we have a couple of kind of key factors. One is the kind of V configuration where you have a co-located threshold so the pilot can access multiple runways from a single piece of pavement. It's very simple, very easy for a pilot to turn onto the wrong piece of pavement and depart. Another risk factor we see there is parallel taxiways. When there are multiple parallel taxiways prior to the runway, we've had pilots who turn onto one of those parallel taxiways prior to the runway and attempt to depart. And so one great example of this, the majority of people in this room flew into Las Vegas Airport on your way here. Las Vegas has almost all of the risk factors I just mentioned. We have 2 sets of parallel runways. they all kind of come together in this one area that's a lot of pavement out there. So Las Vegas has a lot of risk factors kind of all in one location. And where we're seeing, so with those risk factors, you would expect Las Vegas to be very high on the charts for these events, and they are on there. But that brings up the other point that we have barriers in place, and we have mitigations that are working to help protect against some of the worst effects of these events.
So I'm glad you brought that up. I wish I would have known those statistics before, like when I was working back in San Antonio. The event I talked to you about was probably about 8 years ago, but it wasn't on our radar, right, at that time. So that's why we're talking to you now, and that's why in your last 3 current trainings, you saw modules on wrong surface, because you guys are filing those reports, and we're getting the information that we need in order to identify the problems and be able to address them. So thank you, and continue to do so, because I still think that the numbers that we showed you with the facilities earlier, I still think they're kind of low. I think we fixed the problem, so we're like, we're good. But I don't know the data, and I can't correlate where our problems are if we don't get that information in. So please continue to file. The last thing I wanted to talk about here with regards to the contributing factors was, it says up here, miscommunicate and read back, hear back. I want to talk to you about one side that we don't really talk about too much here, and it's the fact that 80% of our readbacks are correct. So if you got a readback for a wrong, and you end up getting a wrong surface arrival, 80% of the time, it was actually a correct readback. So that kind of sets you up as a controller, right? Because we assume that when somebody reads it back, they're actually going to do what they said they were going to do, right? We make the assumption that pilots are proficient in experience, that a pilot knows exactly where they're going and knows the airport layout by all means. So we're already put into this assumption bias by getting this correct readback. So really what this brings us into is we know what our contributing factors are, but how do we start managing the risk within the NAS? So first off, we're going to collaboratively work with our industry partners to basically deploy solutions. Right? So a couple months ago, the FAA had a safety summit, and during that safety summit, we brought together a bunch of industry personnel by all means, and we just talked about wrong surface events. And hopefully by having those type of events, what we're actually doing is bringing that heightened sense of awareness to the field and allowing our industry members to talk to their constituents about what we are seeing. Right? Another example of this is probably about 6-8 months ago, we had a wrong surface work group. It was co-sponsored by AJT and NACA, and we actually had it at NACA headquarters, where we brought in facilities that have had some type of wrong surface event. We brought in the facility representatives and their counterpart, and we talked about mitigations that we could put in place in the NAS to help with wrong surface. Those are the examples of collaboration that I want to continue with. Another element here that I think is highly important is a proactive SMS process. And that's where I mentioned, like, keep filing those reports because I actually need them. Well, when I talk about collecting data and assessing the data, I can't assess the data if I don't have the data, right? So we're going to assess the data, we're going to develop mitigations, and then we're going to put them in, and by all means, we're going to measure their effectiveness. If something's not working, then we got to change it and try something else and attack it from a different angle. But we've done this with wrong surface. We did this in 2017, and we did this in 2018, and that's where we got those contributing factors from. That's how we got to the point where it became a top 5. That's also, obviously now it's a continuous top 5. So procedures for pilots and air traffic. In particular for pilots, one of the big things that have came out as a best practice is making sure that you back up a visual approach with an instrument approach. So that's a common practice held. And technology. With regards to technology, I do believe that it's a direct mitigation for situational awareness. And at this time, Dan, can you kind of go over some of the technology enhancements we're looking for at wrong surface?
Sure. So from a technology standpoint, we've got the approach runway verification, which is in very early phases. We're still kind of working on the concept and how it would work with stars. The main purpose behind it would be for aircraft lining up for the wrong runway. It could be expanded to taxiways, but for now we want to focus on the wrong runway aspect of things. It would be visible by both TRACON and tower controllers, so both parties would be aware of what's going on. And we're looking at sometime in the third quarter of 2020, depending on how things go. The key site would most likely be Seattle, correct, for that?
For this, I don't think it's been decided upon yet.
Okay, so it's still been undecided, but we're working on that as we speak, in addition to how it would operate. With that being said, what we have accomplished is taxiway alerts for ASDX. And the parameters are basically the same. It's site adaptable. It's currently functioning at Seattle, and it's also in play at
It's also Atlanta right now.
Atlanta right now.
We're turning on Bradley.
And then Bradley should be turned on this week. From a controller standpoint, it's pretty seamless. All 35 ASDX sites are going to be looked at as potential deployment sites for this enhancement. The 7 ASSC sites will probably be evaluated down the road. If you look at this next map here, this is an actual depiction of what ASDX views at the Seattle airport. The larger blue areas are what the system looks at when it starts tracking airplanes that are inbound to land. Inside of that, you could see the orange areas, and that's the actual taxiway arrivals that have been developed for the system. Before the controllers see any of this, it's all analyzed in Oklahoma City. Everything's modified. There's changes that are made. Again, we want 0 false alerts. We want it to work flawlessly. We don't want to negatively impact what you guys have going on right now. So from an actual system standpoint, that's what goes on behind the scenes that nobody really sees on a day-to-day basis. As far as what the controller sees in the tower, it's nothing different than what you guys would see now. You'll get the oral alert, and you'll also get the visual alert on the display. You send the aircraft around, we go on with business as usual, and you guys do what you do best. If you guys have any further questions, comments, thoughts, ideas, whatever, you could find us throughout this event, and we'll be more than happy to talk with you. We're looking for input. We're looking for any ideas you guys have. You know, it's obviously an ATO top 5, and we want to address it in the best time frame that we can and be as efficient as we can about things.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Stop by the surface safety booth. Come visit with us. We'll talk about this a little bit more in depth. And remember that, safety works when we all work together. Thank you.